Hello and welcome to Full Court Press. I'm Michael Lyon. I want the show to be more specialized and have more of a focus. So this is going to be the first episode of a new season, which I'm calling Moreyball, where the focus will be on how basketball has changed over the past decade, with the pace of play increasing, the formation of super teams, and an analytic style perspective of basketball becoming more prevalent. So today, for the first episode, I'm joined by my friend Yusheng, who is a big Rockets fan that has been following the Rockets in the NBA since the early 2000s. As my audience knows, I've been a big Celtics fan for a long time, so both me and Yusheng are fans of polarizing teams that have been the leaders in bringing some of these major changes in style to the NBA. That starts with the Rockets, who has definitely emphasized an analytic style of basketball. So Yusheng, do you think that the Rockets' style of play over the last few years has been good enough for them to win a championship?
First of all, I want to say that as a Rockets fan, I'm constantly having to defend myself and the team. Personally, I think Daryl Morey couldn't have run the team better the last 10 years, despite what all the critics, what all the haters say about, the play style, the lack of a championship, the James Harden critics and what they think he's personally doing to the game. As a Rockets fan, I think that everything that the team has done in the past 10 years has led us closer to a championship. And, the counter is, had we not run into Golden State, one of the greatest teams in all of NBA history, I think, the view on Daryl Morey and Moreyball, the analytics movement, ISO three-pointers by Harden, everybody's opinion would be a lot different than that. And I think that's tough because, I think all the other components are there to justify the Rockets' revolution of basketball. It's just, not having that ring, which is a valid criticism in my opinion. So
it's interesting. I agree with some of that. I think because if they had beaten the Warriors just once, like in that Game 7, then the narrative would be completely different. I think that their style of play is good enough to win I think they could have won a championship like that. I think the major criticism comes down to James Harden's level of play, and I know we can get into that. I think that was their ultimate downfall, was that during the biggest moments in the playoffs, James Harden had multiple opportunities to perform at a very high level, which he's proven he can do in the regular season, and he didn't quite live up to that in the biggest moments. But in terms of just the style and the way that they play basketball, with even given all the ISOs and given the team is built around James Harden, that's something the NBA hasn't really seen anything like that before. Their whole offense flows through him. They don't take mid-range shots because they're inefficient, and everything's focused on finding the open three or layups.
Well, I will say, that's the what-if game is easy to play, right? You could say that about a lot of teams that lost it very closely. But I feel like the Rockets losing it in 2017 in Game 7 isn't necessarily a reflection of a failure of Moreyball. If anything, the team that we lost against, the Warriors, them being so successful over the past 10 years, kind of reflects the success of the strategy, in my opinion. If you look at that year where we lost, and even a few other years where we lost to the Warriors, it's not like we played a different team with a different style, and a different theme that went against our core values of analytics, the 3-point line, of the inside versus outside game, no mid-range shots, and ISO game. The fact that they were able to do it successfully, if anything, validates kind of Daryl Morey's strategy. I think most people would agree that the 2017 Warriors, they just had a better team with better players, right? I think Curry, Thompson, although they don't hunt for fouls as much as Harden and they play more aesthetically pleasing to a lot of people, they demonstrated that the strategy of shooting 3-pointers does work, right? Especially Curry, who although he does find his teammates, he also has a lot of ISO ball and plays heavily on the 3-point line, obviously. So I think that's justification for the strategy, if anything.
Yeah, no, and they shoot high. I mean, the Warriors shoot high volume of threes, as anybody. They're doing that too. But for the Rockets, when a lot of the strategy relies so heavily on iso ball, when the person who's doing the isolation shoots 2 for 13 from three, of course they're gonna lose. If the whole strategy is built around that, and then that player doesn't, because there's a lot of pressure on Harden. There's when the whole offense revolves around him, he's going to have to play big. 2 for 13 isn't good enough. So we can move into like Harden specifically, and has he played well enough within that system for them to win a championship? I think Game 6 against the Spurs in 2017, Game 7 against the Warriors in 2018. There's just been too many opportunities that he's had to repeat like these 60-point games in the regular season, 50-point games. Like this year, in this calendar year, he has more 50-point games than LeBron has in his career, but he hasn't really been able to replicate that in the biggest moments in the playoffs. When you look at the other great players, you'll see the moments like that is when they do step up. So if maybe, well, the style of play is valid, maybe they need a better player than Harden to carry them to a championship within that style.
I think, first of all, I agree with you completely that playoff basketball is different than regular season basketball. It's why the majority of the NBA's 50, 60-point games all come during the regular season. It's not just the fact that the regular season has more games, but also it's a different kind of style of play, right? And, arguably speaking, when Harden has a 50, 60, 70, I mean, not 70, but hopefully that's coming soon. But when Harden has a 50 or 60-point game, typically, if you look at his past, it's against pretty bad defenses and pretty bad teams. But I think that Harden has just set such a high standard during some of his regular season explosions that kind of you expect that from a player. And I think it's unfair for him to maybe average, upper 20s, lower 30s in a series. And because it's lower than his maybe 37 points per game or 38, which is what he's averaging right now, that you call him kind of a failure, right? I think it's very hard to replicate that in the playoffs for anybody. And I think what Harden doesn't have that the benefit of the Warriors had is they had kind of a full cast, right? They had Thompson, they had Durant, they had Green, and Harden, he's had help before, right? But definitely not in the same form as Curry with the Warriors. And I think Harden's career is still being written right now, and the Rockets are going to still be in contention the next 2 or 3 years. If they had not, once again, run into the Warriors, they could have won maybe multiple championships under their belt. It's just very unfortunate timing, right?
Yeah, well, it's for that reason because some people think that Warriors dynasty is like the best group, like best core of all time. So I think that does validate the strategy that they came with it. Like there's so many the Chris Paul injury. Had he not gotten injured, had they not had the worst 3-point shooting night in the history of the play or whatever it is, there's a lot of things that they got so close that I think it does validate the strategy. But for Harden, I think, he'll have more opportunities. But do you agree that he has to play better in the playoffs?
I think so. But as I said, right, like the Rockets had a 65-win season where they lost to arguably maybe one of the best basketball teams of all time in 7 games after their second superstar went down with an injury for Game 6 and 7.
Right.
I think in any other year, James Harden, his style of play, Daryl Morey, the analytics movement the Rockets are making would be completely validated and justified, right? And I think the numbers all speak to it. And I think, yes, Harden does have to improve come playoff time, but I think he'll adjust, And I think with the rest of the NBA, right, also adapting this style, you're going to see kind of similar situations with other players maybe struggling with their shot in the playoffs, and I wouldn't necessarily call that a failure. So,
well, that's why I think this year is such a big year for the Rockets because they don't. I mean, there's other great teams, but there's not the level of dynasty that they had to face in the Warriors the last few years. So there's not. I mean, as far as an excuse goes, there's less of that excuse. So there's a lot of pressure. Like a lot of my thoughts on Harden, like his points per game go down in the playoffs, and it's not like he's scoring low, but the whole offense revolves around him, and he goes from like last year he'll go from 36 to 32, and LeBron goes, if you look at his career, not to compare him to LeBron, but if you want to be great, you have to start looking at some of the great players. LeBron goes from the mid 20s to the high 20s, low 30s in the playoffs, and there's years during his 2016 superhero championship run, he'll average 34.
I think the counter to that is the Rockets, player and personnel wise, have just not been as good as maybe LeBron James with Kyrie and Kevin Love, or maybe, the Warriors with that super team, right? Look at the Rockets roster. You have James Harden, right? And then I think in 2017 against the Warriors, right, you had James Harden, Chris Paul, Clint Capella, Eric Gordon, Ryan Anderson, right? A lot of people argue that, Clint Capella's value only comes because of James Harden throwing him lobs in the style of play that the Rockets have. A lot of people, wrote Eric Gordon off before he came to the Rockets because of all his knee injuries. And on the Pelicans, he averaged 13 points a game before he came over here. You had Ryan Anderson playing a huge role, and you didn't see him have any level of success, on a different team the way that he was on the Rockets. So I think, a lot of people have these high expectations for the Rockets because they do so well in the regular season. But I would actually argue, with this cast, especially if your argument that, Harden's numbers are all boosted by D'Antoni and the system, I would argue that if it wasn't for this system, the Rockets wouldn't even be in the conversation for a championship in the first place.
That's fair. So say with this group, this style of play, so I think we're both kind of in agreement that with this core of players, the way that they've played for the last few years has put them in the best possible, given them the best possible chance to win a championship.
I agree. I think it'd be hard pressed to find a lot of people that would take that cast of individual players before their performance on the Rockets and given them championship hopes or a 65-win team.
For raw level of talent, they definitely overachieved. I think the results speak for themselves in terms of...
I would agree there. And yeah. I think, I think we're still in championship contention, and if we win that, championship maybe this year or next year, it'll silence kind of all the haters once and for all. So
it will. But then it gets interesting because they lost to the Warriors because they weren't as talented, right? So if you put Kevin Durant on the Rockets, is their same isolation style of basketball still optimal? Or would you switch it off and let Kevin Durant do what Harden does half the time, or would you would you just switch it all up?
They play different positions, and Mike D'Antoni historically he's always utilized great point guards, right? Whether that be Steve Nash or James Harden, and Kevin Durant for all of his skills and talents, he's not a point guard, right? But you also saw kind of the Warriors, playing similarly and having to adjust once they added Kevin Durant to the fold, right? And you saw a lot more isolation with Kevin Durant in the playoffs, and he would get you buckets down the stretch. And that's the benefit of having someone like that. So I think, the Rockets would also adjust accordingly, having Durant, on their roster. But,
okay. I think what I'm getting at is, if you have a well-rounded championship caliber roster with players that are talented enough to win a championship, could it ever be the case where the style of play that the Rockets use is the best to win a championship?
I would say that's a hard question because the entire Rockets roster is constructed in a way that complements this style of play. And that's think, we wouldn't have the same style of play if we had a different roster, to answer your question. And we wouldn't have a different roster, utilizing kind of this strategy, this head coach, and this style of play. Because in free agency, we specifically look for 3-and-D players, right? We specifically look for players that fit within the system. And I think Daryl Morey did a good job of identifying Harden as someone that would succeed as kind of the centerpiece of D'Antoni's offense. So I think the two are complementary of each other. And, obviously, having maybe a Kevin Durant or a Kawhi Leonard on our team, something like that would change our play style for sure. And I think with just that level of raw talent, you might not need to innovate as much for you to just compete traditionally and go out and just with your raw talent win a championship.
So for the style they used the last 2 years, I'm thinking about how Chris Paul fit into that. Do you think they utilized him correctly? Because I think what they tried to do is use him as kind of a piece around Harden, not in the same way as PJ Tucker or some of the other pure role players. He was a little bit more ball dominant than that. But they didn't change their style the way they would have to if they added Kevin Durant or Paul. Do you think that was correct?
I think that's different because I think Paul, when he joined the Rockets, he was still a superstar, but he was obviously declining already in his later years of his career, and he was coming into a system that was well established, that was already proven to some degree successful before he joined. So you saw kind of Chris Paul adjusting, right? Chris Paul shot the most three-pointers he ever had in his career. He shot them at a good percentage. And Chris Paul also a lot of times, ceded the ball to Harden during clutch situations, although we saw some of that bickering the following year in the playoffs against the Warriors. But, it was largely successful because he was willing to kind of make these sacrifices and change to this style of play. But like I said, if, we get like a Kevin Durant, we get like a Kawhi Leonard, or we get like a, Giannis, right? I don't think the Rockets would continue to kind of necessarily employ the system the way it is, because I think Daryl Morey correctly identified James Harden as, the centerpiece of D'Antoni's offense. So
yeah, and I think ultimately Harden could be the centerpiece of a championship team.
Oh, for sure. And if we already had the personnel to, in a traditional sense, dominate and win a championship, why would anyone want to change anything, right? If this team was already capable of being successful and we had, a fully built championship contender in the traditional sense, the only way we had to revolutionize and kind of play this style was because it got us to championship contention, and that was not where we were before.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that team, like with Chris Paul, the last couple of years could have been enough in a lot of years in the NBA that didn't have such a dynasty like the Warriors.
Oh, for sure, like absolutely. And I think we talk about this in one of the later episodes, but the direction of the league itself speaks volumes to Moreyball, right? You see other teams adapting. You see kind of a general shift to analytics, and that was all revolutionized by the Rockets back office, right? We were the first. I think over the last couple of years, we've led the league in 3-point shooting and defending the 3-point shot and inside the paint, right? Those are areas that we don't want other teams to target as well. And in terms of constructing our roster, right, in our coaching staff, all of this is kind of focused on this grand plan that Daryl Morey has, and I think a lot of the other teams in the league are kind of following suit, right?
Yeah, the Rockets are the ones that have been like the leaders in planning around that. But in general for the league, like all the successful teams are shooting a lot more threes. Like it's not specific to the Rockets that shooting a lot of threes and layups is going to win games. And it's not like the Warriors won by ISO mid-range. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's just, as a Rockets fan, it's so excruciating to be so close, especially being a fan of such a polarizing team. You just want to have something at the end of the day to kind of show for it. But I think we just have to be patient, and Harden still got a nice few years left in him. So
yeah. And ultimately, I think we agree that this is the best strategy the Rockets could have used, and in a lot of years, it could have been good enough to win a championship.
I think so. Yeah. I think if we don't win a championship in this era, 2017, that Game 7 series with the Warriors, that 65-win team, is the best we're going to see in this era of basketball from the Rockets with, being the revolutionaries of Moreyball. With that being said, I think if we had not played the way that we did, and if we had not made this transition, we would not have been in the championship conversation that year or even this era. I think we played above expectations with our roster, and I think this is a coaching strategy that does work, even though we specifically did not win the championship in 2017.
I agree, and it puts a lot of pressure on Harden, which is why without the presence of the Warriors this year, he's going to be judged a lot based on what he does this playoffs.
I definitely see that. I think Harden is a polarizing player, but I think he's also very good, and he does need to be better in the playoffs, but he has had good playoff games. They've come kind of in the earlier rounds, and that's kind of also what you get with this style of play is kind of the volatility of 3-point shooting, right? But it's kind of a sacrifice that as a fan I'm willing to see my team take. So
yeah. All right, well, we're trying to make these episodes a little bit shorter. We know you audience have a short attention span, so if you disagree with what we've said or what one of us have said, reach out and I'll put you on the show and we can talk about it.
And just a disclaimer, I fully recognize anyone that doesn't like necessarily the aesthetic appeal of watching basketball the way it's revolutionized and watching James Harden style of play. But if you have any reason to kind of have a counter argument about how he's not a good player or this isn't the right way to play basketball to get wins, feel free to give us kind of a shout out, and we'll see what we can do. So
yeah. So thanks, Yusheng, for coming on, and it's been a good start to the first season, Moreyball.